Hello everybody and welcome to our webinar on introducing trauma-informed practice in your setting. This is quite a long webinar as we have a lot of content to cover. So if you can't stick around, don't worry, this will be on our website on the resources and downloads page later today. And that's www.greatmindstogether.co.uk. We are covering a lot of sensitive content due to the nature of the topic we are talking about. So if anybody needs any support after watching this webinar, you are welcome to get in touch. And our number is 0161 549 1169.
So when we think about brain development and trauma, it's often helpful to think about using the metaphor of a house. Our brains are built through a process that begins before birth and continues into adulthood. So like the construction of a house, the building process happens in a sequence. First, we lay the foundations, then we shape the rooms, and later we're wiring the electrical system. And these things obviously have to happen in the correct order. Just like building materials have varying degrees of quality, the quality of a child's early experience, the foundations of a house, affect the sturdiness of that child's brain architecture. Early experiences literally shape how our brain is built. They shape brain development and provide the foundation upon which future learning, health, and behaviour all depend.
So the principles of neurodevelopment. The brain is underdeveloped at birth, but it is developed at 80% by the time a child reaches 2 years of age. The next 20% of development takes up to 38 more years. The brain is a remarkable thing, and scientists still only know a very small amount about the brain and its capacity. The brain organises from the bottom up, so the brainstem to cortex and from the inside out. So as you can see on this image here, the purple part of the brain is the thinking brain, the green part of the brain is the emotional brain, and the red part of the brain is the survival brain. And if you think about looking that from red up to purple, it's very similar to Maslow's hierarchy of need, which we did talk about in another one of our webinars that's also on our site in regards to challenging behaviour.
So this visual is reflective of what healthy brain development looks like. So if we think about the red section in terms of the survival state, so this is the brain stem. So our initial need for safety, for food, for air, for water, that's held within the brain stem. And the brain, as we noted before, the brain develops from the bottom up. We move on to the limbic system, represented by the blue colour, and that's the mid-level functionality. And the only way to soothe an upset emotional state is through connection. So safety, connection, and we move on to problem solving. So the green reflects the executive state, so our executive functioning. Again, thinking about the brain development from the bottom up, so safety, connection leads on to the ability to problem solve. The brain state asks the question, what can I learn from this?
So with that in mind, and our reference on the previous slide to Maslow's hierarchy of need, looking at your survival, emotional state and executive state, you've then got a visual here that explains Maslow's hierarchy of need. So at the very bottom, and this is, as you can see, you've got a triangle here, and you can only move up the triangle if the needs are met on every level in order. So it's very much like the brain working from the bottom up. You've also got the hierarchy of needs. So the very bottom, the red, your physiological needs, which is your air, your water, your food, shelter, sleep, clothing, etc. You've then got your safety needs, which is your security, employment, resources, health. Then your love and belonging, which is your emotional needs, friendship, do you belong, intimacy, family, sense of connection, which is your connection. And then your esteem, which is your respect, self-esteem, a lot to do with confidence, strength, freedom. And then as you go to the very top of the triangle, which is your self-actualization, which is your desire to become the most that one can be. Also your executive state, which is on the previous slide as we've shown you with the brain development.
Adverse childhood experiences, known as ACEs, are defined as highly stressful events or situations that occur during childhood and adolescence. It can be a single event or incident or prolonged threats to a child or young person's safety, security, or bodily integrity. These experiences require significant social, emotional, neurobiological, psychological, and behavioural adaptations to survive.
And as you can see on the visual on the right, you've got 3 types of adverse childhood experiences, which include abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So under abuse, you have your physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. You have under neglect, your physical and your emotional neglect. And there's lots of common misconceptions about emotional neglect, and that doesn't necessarily mean that can be a parent who doesn't care. It actually could be a single parent struggling to meet the needs of a young person. So they're working 80 hours a week, they're a single parent, they've got no support network. And actually, they're not being able to provide the emotional support to a child because of how busy they are trying to meet their basic needs, which is very much relevant in lots of deprived areas as a result of the recent austerity in the country. So that is very common in lots of areas at the moment. Also, household dysfunction, so mental illness, incarcerated relatives, so somebody who's been in prison, a mother that's been treated violently, or a father, and that's your domestic violence, substance abuse, and also divorce, but also separation, a loss, where a child might be grieving for somebody who was in the family who are no longer in the family.
So the terms adversity and trauma are often interchangeably used by professionals, and there are differences. Whilst adversity describes the situation and experience that a person has, trauma refers more commonly to the impact it has on their mental health. ACEs are defined as highly stressful events or situations that occur during childhood and/or adolescence. It can be a single event or incident, or prolonged threats to a child or young person's safety, security, or bodily integrity. These experiences require significant social, emotional, neurobiological, psychological, and behavioural adaptations to survive. And ACEs are more common than you might think. Almost half of all adults living in the UK have experienced at least one form of adversity in their childhood or adolescence, with 1 in 5 experiencing at least 4 or more. This number's only increasing, particularly during a pandemic where there are real as well as perceived threats to life.
So the 3 realms of adverse childhood experiences, you've got your household, your community, and your environment. So there's a common misconception that a traumatic event can just be one single incident or event, as we mentioned earlier, but actually it can be as a result of prolonged threats to safety and integrity. Adverse childhood and community experiences can occur in the household, the community, or in the environment and cause toxic stress. When they're left unaddressed, toxic stress from ACEs harms children and families, organisations, systems and communities, and reduces the ability of individuals and entities to respond to stressful events with resiliency. Research has shown that there are many ways to reduce and heal from toxic stress and build healthy, caring communities. So when you're looking in your household, you've got things like domestic violence, physical and emotional neglect, divorce, homelessness, parental mental illness, alcoholism and drug abuse, emotional and sexual abuse, bullying, and family members that have gone to prison, and maternal depression. And then when you look into your community, you've got things like lack of jobs, substandard schools, or schools that are struggling with resources and struggling to meet need of the students within their schools, historical trauma, discrimination, violence, lack of social capital and mobility. So children and young people that are socially isolated, which is very relevant from this past year. Structural racism, poor water and air quality, food scarcity, substandard wages, poverty and poor housing quality and affordability. And then when we look at the environment, well, this is very relevant now, isn't it? So the current pandemic is an ACE that every child, young person and adult is currently going through, not just in our country, but across our world. So we are yet to realise the impact on the children and young people specifically going forward as a result of the current pandemic. And it's being mindful that we might be seeing very different behaviours, especially as they're transitioning back into school when, you know, they've been out of school for some time. So it's something that we need to be extremely aware of, especially now more than ever. So we're going to show you a little video now that just covers off everything that we've just been talking about, and just to give you a bit of a break from our voices as well.
The brain develops from the bottom up. The first thing to develop is the brainstem, or the reptilian brain as some people might call it. This area is responsible for our bodily functions. It tells us when to regulate our temperature, when to sleep, and when to eat. The next important part of our brains to develop is the limbic system, or what some people might call the mammalian part of the brain. The limbic system supports a variety of functions including emotion, behaviour, motivation, and long-term memory. The next part of the brain to develop is the cortex, which is the outer layer of the brain. This is sometimes considered the human part because humans are one of the only mammals that develop this part of the brain. This part of the brain is responsible for how we as humans were able to develop language, have thoughts, self-awareness, perception, and consciousness. Also, the cortex plays a key role in integrating the central nervous system and functions of memory. The last and most advanced part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is considered the executive functioning part of the brain. For some people, this part doesn't fully develop until they're in their mid to late 20s. The prefrontal cortex helps us to think through cause and effect, the ability to plan for the future, set goals, and understand the consequences of our actions. It's also responsible for the ability to moderate social behaviour. When we're in a stressful situation, part of our limbic system called the amygdala sets off an alarm bell response to let us know we're in danger and we need to do something about it. When this happens, the brain floods with a hormone called cortisol, so the body knows that something needs to be done. The most common responses to a stressful or dangerous situation are some you might be familiar with: fight, flight, freeze, or submit. This is an inbuilt system of survival to keep us safe when we're in danger. Like when our ancestors might have had to decide whether to stand their ground and fight against a large predator or run away. A stress response is a healthy, normal part of being a human. It lets us know that our bodies are working and keeping us safe. If a person is exposed to a highly stressful or traumatic event, or they have continual exposure to stressful events like abuse or neglect, their alarm system might become overactive. It might be always switched on, as if there was a risk of danger or threat at all times. For a child, this might affect how their brain develops. This is especially the case if it's in the context of stress or trauma events by a primary caregiver. In these cases, the child might develop an understanding of the world as an unsafe and dangerous place, even when they are in a safe situation. Sometimes this is called hypervigilance. It means being on edge or aware of danger at all times. Being exposed to stressful and traumatic events on a regular basis can also have a significant impact on neural connections in the memory center. It can even change the way we remember actual events. People use alcohol and other drugs for a variety of reasons. When someone's experienced trauma, they might be in a constant state of fight or flight, and so might use substances to help move them out of their stress response state. We also know that substance use can affect the way that our brain functions. Chemicals from substances cross the blood-brain barrier and can either stimulate or depress different parts of the central nervous system, affecting how the person feels, thinks, and acts. Similar to cortisol flooding the brain in the stress response, chemicals from alcohol and other drugs can also affect neural pathways and the way the person might make decisions or remember events. Luckily, neural pathways have the lifelong ability to form and change. You might have heard this referred to as neural plasticity. Through developing a better understanding of the brain and the way trauma and alcohol and other drugs affect neural pathways, clients can be better informed and empowered. This is an intervention itself called psychoeducation.
So just a few points to make on that video. It was an Australian video and they did refer to the word submit, and we might know that more as flop, or fawn is also another F. So there is fight, flight, freeze, flop, and fawn. Flop is where somebody may just literally flop to the floor and they don't know how to deal with it and they're so overwhelmed by what's happening in that moment. So the fawn response is an instinctual response associated with a need to avoid conflict and trauma via appeasing behaviours. So for example, a child or young person can present with fawning behaviours that might be to survive or cope and respond to make friends and befriend with their abuser. So we did touch on this again in our other video on challenging behaviours, and it's about children, young people specifically, or children with additional needs who are vulnerable and susceptible to exploitation, for example, not recognising themselves as victims, and that is their brain instinctively trying to protect them.
A wide range of experiences can be described as adverse, and that includes maltreatment. So, as we touched on earlier, physical, sexual, emotional, and financial abuse and neglect. Violence and coercion. So, if we think about experiencing or actually directly witnessing something, including experiences of domestic abuse, assault, harassment, sexual exploitation, experiencing or being witness to sexually harmful behaviour, being the victim of crime or terrorism, gang or cult membership, and bullying. That's a significant one. Household or family adversity. We talked before about concerns relating to families who live in poverty and the impact that that has on childhood experiences, on housing, on instability, being able to pay bills, heat the home, particularly mental ill health in parents, particularly mothers. Research shows that that's a particular concerning risk indicator. Also, we think about here children and young people who are looked after or leaving care, who have had experience of spending time on remand, being arrested, young offenders institutions, and also family or placement breakdown. If we think about bereavement and loss, so the death of a caregiver or sibling, particularly, miscarriage, loss of a child, having an illness or an injury and surviving a natural disaster, terrorism or an accident. So all of these things are ACEs. And if we think about the children, young people that we work with, of particular concern are the children, young people who've experienced multiple ACEs. And if we think about that, the fact that the human brain reacts to a touch within 0.15 of a fifth of a second. So if you think about a child that you may inadvertently touch, who then reacts, actually we need to think about what's led to that. And actually, if we can understand that child and understand their histories, we would then know the best way to support them. Last but not least, we also think about prejudice, so discrimination, victimisation, experiencing hate incidents and crime because of the colour of the skin, because of who they are, because of what they look like. Other attitudes, chronic exposure to behaviours and institutional processes, sexism, racism, and particularly disableism. It's also important to think about institutional trauma. Children who have experienced significant ACEs, particularly multiple ACEs, may respond negatively to sanctions, be more disruptive in class, and being told off or sanctioned is likely to be a trigger for them, meaning they are likely to present with challenging behaviour. This is a really important part of the work that we do at Great Minds Together. Children and people regularly experience trauma in school as a result of their unmet needs, as a result of the right support not being put in place. And these children often face inappropriate sanctions and exclusions, and often disengage of education altogether. And we begin to see lateness and persistent absence. And it's a sign actually that something's going on for that child or young person. There's always a need behind behaviour.
Yeah, and just to add to that, really, it's just recognising if you are seeing persistent behaviour for a young person, there's definitely something more going on. So continually sanctioning that young person, if it's not working after the first couple of weeks, it's not going to work, and actually it's going to add to their trauma and is only going to escalate their behaviours. At that point, we would always recommend linking with the family, finding out what's happening at home. Also, is there anything that's happened in the past for that young person? Has there been a loss, a death in the family that might have happened recently or even a few months ago? You could be seeing a delayed reaction to that. So there's lots and lots of different reasons. It's not always that there is going to be abuse at the home, but actually there could be something really stressful going on for mum or dad or the caregiver that the child is picking up on. Also, the pandemic, it's very relevant to think about how we need to be adapting our behaviours to support these children, because this is an adverse childhood experience that they are all going through right now. And we might be seeing lots of different behaviours as a result of that. So it's being mindful as adults that we need to support them to be able to articulate their emotions. Their brain is still very much developing. And when you think about the earlier slides, that part of their brain actually hasn't even developed yet, and it's our responsibility to support them with that.
I think another important point to make is the fact that as adults, it's really difficult for us to understand, understanding about how the brain works. Scientists don't know fully how the brain works. And actually, what we need to think about is that we're expecting children to be able to manage that, to stop and think and calm their response that happens almost immediately, when as adults, we find that really difficult as well. And we need to understand our own ACEs as adults to be able to support young people who've experienced it themselves.
And that goes back again, and it really is worth watching in conjunction with this, the challenging behaviour and managing challenging behaviour webinar, because there's lots of support there and strategies to use and things to be aware of on how we can best support children and young people that have had adverse childhood experiences. And it's always thinking what's going on behind that. There is a video here, and again, it is quite sensitive on here, and there is a lot of videos when it comes to ACEs that refer to domestic violence in the home, but it's also just being mindful that it isn't just domestic violence that is an adverse childhood experience. And obviously that is one of the points that we want to get across the most in this webinar, but this video is very relevant to what we're talking about, so we'll give you another break from our voices.
My parents don't understand. All the drinking and fighting means I'm scared. I'd like a cuddle, perhaps a bedtime story, but mostly I'd like them to stop shouting at me. And sometimes they hit me. Feeling scared every day and not feeling loved or wanted will change me for the rest of my life. Later, I'll have problems at school, problems with alcohol, and I'll get in trouble with the police. What's happening to me right now means I'm more likely to have serious health problems in middle age and die sooner than I should. Doctors say my life is full of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. But in my world, this means I see my dad hitting my mum. Dad's got a drinking problem, and mum's always crying, even with the tablets. I am always being shouted at and hit. After the booze and fags, there's not a lot of money for toys or clothes, or even food. I'm getting used to being scared all the time. Now I'm just angry. The doctors say things are changing inside me. My brain isn't learning how to control my feelings properly. My body can't relax like those kids who don't have ACEs, so my body won't be able to repair itself properly when I get older, making it more likely I'll get cancer or heart disease as an adult. It hurts when my parents hit me, but the real damage is hidden, and that damage will be with me for life.
I drink and smoke. They say I'm out of control, but I'm not. It's just my way of coping with my ACEs. I've been in plenty of fights, but what's wrong with that? Kids' punches don't hurt half as much as when my dad hits me. I beat up a kid last week at school because he looked at me weird. Who cares? I ended up with more time out of school. Learning's not for me anyway, and the teachers don't care any more than my parents. I don't like the way anyone looks at me except my girl. She's 16 and pregnant, just like my mum was with me.
So this is where I've ended up. I've got diabetes and cancer's probably on the way. I know these kill you, but I couldn't do without them. I've never had a proper job and I've spent time inside. I hate my kids. I hate their mum too, until she left, so my kids have grown up with aces. And now my daughter had her first kid. She's 16. The course of my life was set in the wrong direction a long time ago. I know where I'm heading, and sadly I know where my kids are heading too. This doesn't have to happen. A little help in childhood makes a big difference to where life takes you. When I was a baby, the nurses noticed that my mum wasn't coping and helped her and explained how important my childhood is to the rest of my life. So, with a bit of help, she coped. The police came round after next door complained about the noise from mum and dad fighting. They asked how I was feeling. I told them I was scared all the time. Mum and dad got help. The shouting got better and the hitting stopped. I even got some bedtime stories. I still had problems at school, but the teacher asked me about what was happening at home. I got help controlling my feelings. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. I'm now married with 2 children, and I've got a job, most of the time. I haven't repeated the same problems with my kids. We got help when being a parent got too much. Our children are ACE-free, and that means their kids stand a good chance of growing up ACE-free as well. Almost half the people in England and Wales experienced 1 ACE as a child, and 1 in 10 of us suffered 4 or more ACEs. If we stop ACEs, millions of children would not become smokers or binge drinkers, and levels of violence in adults would be cut in half. Fewer ACEs in childhood also means fewer adults developing diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes in middle age. We all need to be ACE aware. Are you? Doctors, police, nurses, teachers, firefighters, and most importantly, parents. The more you know about ACEs, the more you can help stop children growing up with ACEs in their lives. And for those of you who have already suffered ACEs, the more you know, the more you can help yourself and others who have suffered ACEs cope.
So as you can probably tell, that was quite an old video, but such a good one we wanted to share with you. And it really highlights the difference of where we are today, because those figures have drastically changed and we are now at 1 in 5 people have 4 or more ACEs. Also, just the importance of that video on breaking the cycle and one person asking, was that child okay? And did they need help? And the support offered to the parents and the wider family, which again is the wraparound support that we are trying to promote as much as possible, because it makes such a difference to a child and young person and their education and life chances.
So we have an image here of 2 brains of 2 3-year-old children. On the left, we have a normal brain, so we consider the size of the normal brain in comparison to the image on the right, where a child has suffered extreme neglect. And that's just to highlight the point that there is a physical change that occurs in the brain. And when we talked before about the fact that the first 2 years of life, the brain develops by up to 80%, then we need to think about actually how crucial those early life experiences are.
And also how much we can then support, and the significant amount of support needed for children that may have experienced adverse childhood experiences. And it's our responsibility to find out if they have experienced ACEs at all. And it's that link with the families. And again, that may not just be abuse, it could be a range of different things. And also young children going through this current pandemic and experiencing other adults being quite anxious around them about everything that's going on, the news on the television all of the time. Obviously, lots of people being quite anxious out and about, not wanting to be near each other. All of that is going to be impactful. So we need to be thinking about what we're doing to make that better for those children, because it can be changed. And we'll come on to that a bit later on.
So how do we recognise trauma in children, young people and adults? So it's obviously not possible to list every single way that distress can be expressed, because it's different for everybody. But below we've described some of the more common ones. So if we think about intrusive memories, they're often more vivid, more volatile, and can be easily triggered by situations that have nothing to do with that. So if you think about a child that might be in a classroom setting who may hear a sudden noise, that may trigger a particular memory. So not only does it trigger a memory, it triggers a physical reaction. And if we think about that physical reaction taking place within a split second, and you may see a child that's in fight response, and actually you may see a physical change. And if we think about the example of being sat there and just all of a sudden hearing a really loud sudden noise. So if you think about that happening to you where you've taken a fright, actually you may jump and there's a physical reaction to that. So your stance will automatically become wider, your body, your posture will change, you'll stand taller, your heart rate will go up, you'll begin to breathe. If we think about that body's primal need for safety, at that point, if your body reacts in a way that it feels it's in immediate danger.
So add another level to that, and then a child not only is witnessing your reaction to that, which could be a trigger, which is a memory, but then the loud bang might also trigger a memory, which triggers a physical response in the child, which adds a layer on top of that, which adds the trauma, and then you see the behaviour, and that child doesn't even know that that's happened to them, and you don't even know that that's happened to them, and that's why we need to be more mindful.
So children, young people who've experienced traumatic events often demonstrate avoidant behaviour. So people will actively try and avoid anything that could be faintly connected to a traumatic experience. And that's to avoid the memory being triggered or a fear of the events repeating themselves. So they may avoid people that remind them of the events or conversations about the past, places, particular situations that bear any resemblance to the events. So this avoidance can end up depriving people of the loving connections that they can have with friends, and also hyperarousal. We often hear this described as hypervigilance. So experiencing trauma can leave us with the belief that we are vulnerable or powerless at every minute of every day. So we can perceive the world as dangerous and other people as threats. So we think about that in the classroom or in the community. That means that the child or young person spends a lot of time focusing on other people and other things, on movement in the classroom. Often you might hear a teacher or a parent say they didn't pay attention. And actually that child or young person did pay attention. They paid attention to things that they perceived as a threat. So whether that's a child, the door opening, the traffic outside, the clock ticking on the wall, it doesn't mean that the child's not paying attention. It means that the body's reaction is taking over and the primal need for safety is there. Depression and low self-esteem, and this is of particular concern when we think about the increasing concerns about the mental health needs of the young people in our society, really, and across the country. So if we interpret traumatic events as meaning we are worthless, powerless, or useless, we may start to withdraw and internalise some of that and become increasingly isolated from the world around us. The less we do, the more our beliefs about ourselves are confirmed. So if we think that no one values or likes us, we're less likely to bother to interact with other people. So by isolating ourselves from others, we start to lack any other evidence that could contradict what we believe. So we withdraw into ourselves, we don't have that social time with other people, we believe that people don't like us, and there's no evidence there to suggest otherwise. So you are in a vicious cycle. One of the particular, I think, to be honest, it's one of the most common concerns that we have about a lot of our young people relates to anxiety and anxiety-related behaviours. This connects to their feelings of insecurity and lack of control. So some people can develop new fears that they didn't have before, or constantly feel anxious about everything in their life or particular things. And in the face of adversity and trauma, some children and young people latch onto behaviours or beliefs that give them a sense of control. Often with young people, you'll see that sense of control demonstrated within what they eat. Because if you think about, actually, I don't like that, that is a behaviour that often parents will tolerate. Okay, well, we'll try something else. They've then got that level of control. And if you think about particularly very young children, they experience demands from the minute they get up to the minute they go to bed. Stop, sit down, stop doing this, sit down, eat that. And actually where you see a child that has a tantrum and feels overwhelmed with emotion because they can't articulate the fact that they don't have any sense of control, and they can then show that in more worrying behaviours, which are known as maladaptive coping strategies.
So, experience of adversity can result in a number of different forms of emotional distress and mental health conditions, and some of which are specifically related to traumatic stress, usually involving a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Many children and young people do not meet this threshold, however. We are often perplexed by explosive outbursts, emotional volatility, and reactions that seem out of proportion to the actual event. Although we are more accepting of this in younger children, we are less tolerant of this in children over the age of 5. We often expect children and young people to manage their emotions in ways that well-balanced adults find difficult, which Meg touched on earlier. Trauma occurs when a person's solution, so their active response to threat, does not work and the nervous system has been overwhelmed. It can result from real or perceived threats. So our nervous system activation is the same for real or perceived threat, and the body can't tell the difference. Trauma is subjective and relative. What I perceive as overwhelming or my capacity for solution may be different than what you perceive as overwhelming.
Trauma creates a disconnect between the mind and the body. Healing can only occur when you feel safe in your body in the present moment. So when you're at a resting nervous system state. So if we link that back to the visuals that were shown earlier in the webinar, we think about that brain developing from the bottom up. Healing can only occur when you feel safe. It's important to remember that someone who's experienced a trauma is not necessarily responding to events in the present moment. So their body is reacting as though that trauma is happening in the moment, but their body may be reacting the same way. So their stress response system, so the survival part of their brain, lives in a state of hyperarousal as a result of past experiences and is easily triggered into a fight or flight response. When the fight or flight response is active, the most helpful action we can take is to give that child or young person resources and solutions until the nervous system re-enters a resting state. So if we think about some of the strategies, and there are many, we can think about how we can provide support to the child or young person in terms of their own coping skills, in helping them when they are calm to identify what those coping skills are and what the strategies are that would work both in the classroom and at home. So we think about the choices that they can make, about enabling them to have a level of choice, taking deep breaths, or thinking physically about the body and how we can calm the body, giving them space to calm down, get down to their level, particularly if it's a young child, because if you think about you being stood over a child that's in that traumatic state, who's perceiving you as a threat, we need to be mindful particularly of our own bodies and our voices and speaking calmly, being mindful of our own facial expressions.
And also here, there are lots of policies and procedures in schools in regards to positively handling children and young people where their behaviour becomes extremely aggressive. They might be hitting out, they might be, there might be a risk of harm to others. But it's also being mindful at the same time that you might be dealing with a child or young person that's experienced an adverse childhood experience or trauma. And if you link then what could happen to that child or young person when they are being positively handled or restrained, and their reaction could potentially escalate as a result. And if that does happen, be mindful to remove yourself from that situation straight away and just give as much space as safely as possible. And sometimes it's just taking the child out into the playground, get some fresh air, follow at a safe distance while they are able to just try and calm themselves down. And then when they're ready, help them calm themselves down, because they can't always do it themselves.
So lots of you work in schools and parents and work in community settings with children, young people who are struggling with the mental health. And it's very unlikely that most young people will reach the point where they receive intervention from statutory services unless there is a clear and significant risk of physical harm. And even then, there's often limited support in real terms outside of medical settings. So as a result, now more than ever after the pandemic, it means you as practitioners need to be able to understand trauma and how it presents, and to arm yourselves with some strategies you can put into practice in your own setting. So within this short briefing, we're obviously unable to provide detailed specific information. However, we'll create a link on our website and we'll provide some additional links, videos and resources for further reading and guidance in your settings.
So as professionals working in this field, we come across some really common phrases that we hear all the time, and you may have heard them yourself. Things like it's too late, they are broken, and there's only so much I can do. I'm too busy to work in a trauma-informed way. I'm not trained to manage their behaviour, it's too complex. None of this is true. What we should be saying and thinking and adopting a more growth mindset approach to this situation is the young people who need the most love will often ask for it in the most unloving ways. Adversity is not their destiny if the pattern is broken. Trauma is healed through safe relationships. Relationships are the most powerful therapeutic tool. Connection through empathy and safety is always the priority, as relationships may be where the damage is done, but they are also where the healing takes place too. Negative impacts of ACEs are significantly mitigated by having an always available, trusted adult. Remember to listen, understand, and support. Another thing to always remember, that it just takes one person to change a child's life. Ask questions, be professionally curious, and make sure that you know everything there is to know about the children that you are teaching or supporting.
So we've just highlighted here some of the main points that we think it's important to remember. One of the main ones being that it's never too late to shape and support strong brain development. We don't have to give up on a child who's got underdeveloped executive functioning skills, which can be demonstrated through challenging behaviour. Children can be supported to develop that at any age with the proper support. People at any stage in their life can gain an understanding of how adversity and trauma has impacted their life, whether that's a child, young person or adult. And everyone can build new ways of making meaning out of it and learning to live beyond the trauma. Understanding the deep-rooted and pervasive ways that someone can be impacted by adversity and trauma allows us to better deliver as professionals flexible and tailored support. This could include techniques to manage stress, skills to regulate emotions, and the development of supportive social networks for people at all stages of life. The importance of social networks can't be underestimated for young people if we think about the experiences of isolation during the pandemic, but also about parent-to-parent support. Great Minds Together, that's a big part of what we do in terms of linking parents, in terms of sharing knowledge and shared experience, being able to talk to other people whose children present maybe the same way. It's very, very difficult to manage complex behaviour in a school setting. So if we think about a parent that's dealing with that at home, and often when home can be the safe place, if they're really struggling in school and they're struggling with the peers and can't build relationships with other young people, what we need to think about there is how we can best support the parent who may have also experienced their own ACEs, and social networks is a big part of that. So how can that be developed in your own setting? No brain's perfect, and there are always opportunities that we can all take up to strengthen a child's brain, and having negative experiences early on does not set a child on a fixed path.
So we have one more video here, and there's just a bit of a recap on everything that we've learned so far.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two, from eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things building sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation, can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport, all those planes landing and taking off, and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead, and remember and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their mind. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
So how do we know if a child has experienced trauma? Well, we don't. The child doesn't know. It's all they've ever known. An experience that they've been through is just an experience they're going through. They wouldn't think to tell anybody about anything that's going on because that's the life as they know it in that moment. And it's up to us as a community to create nurturing environments to help with positive brain development because we don't know what's going on. And making sure that you are, again, being professionally curious. Do you have good relationships with the parents, carers that you support in? Do you have good relationships with those families? Do they feel like they can come to you and talk to you about things? Are you able to signpost them? Do you know what's available in your local area? There are two sensitive periods of brain development where it is most susceptible to change, which is early childhood, 0 to 5 years, and then adolescence, 12 to 25. This is where you can have the most influence of a child or young person, but that isn't to say that you can influence or change the development of their brain outside of these ages. So we might just need to support them for a lot longer and more intensively.
Rather than following a prescribed set of policies and procedures, a trauma-informed approach adheres to 6 key principles, which we've outlined below. So number 1, safety. So the physical setting's safe, and interpersonal interactions promote a sense of safety. So throughout the organisation, you would expect staff and the people or children they support to feel physically and psychologically safe, linking us back to Maslow's hierarchy of need. So this includes a safe space for a child or a young person to go if they feel dysregulated, and also importantly, an opportunity for them to regulate and rejoin a class or a setting without feeling shamed for their reactions. Trustworthiness. Organisational operations and decisions take account of true transparency and the goal of building and maintaining trust amongst children and young people and staff, as well as their family members. So opportunities to build trust can be wide and far-reaching. So it can be something as small as calling a parent back at an agreed time So a child trusting you with knowledge about them and acting in a way that they believe you are not judging them by what they've told you. So number 3 is collaboration. So true partnering and levelling of power differences between staff and parents and children, and among other organisational staff, so from support staff to senior leadership. There is recognition that healing happens in relationships and in the meaningful sharing of power in decision making. Remember, it can take one relationship with one person to make a difference to someone's life, and that you can be that person. Number 4, empowerment. So throughout the organisation and amongst parents, carers and children, individual strengths are recognised, built on and validated, and new skills are developed as necessary. This involves working in a strengths-based way and encouraging the individual to empower themselves. Number 5 is choice. So the organisation aims to strengthen the staff's, children's and the family members' experience of choice and recognise that every person's experience is unique and requires an individualised approach.
So we're going to do some self-reflection here now. So if you are watching this on a webinar, you can pop some answers in the chat. Your answers might help other people that are watching today. If you're watching this in a school and this is being delivered in a school, then this is where we might break to do this activity. So 1, how can you, with the help of your senior leaders and management team, embed trauma-informed practice into your setting? So feel free to pop some comments and some ideas around that. Number 2, what things can you personally do to help children, young people and their family members feel safe? If you want to just pop the number before your answer so we know which question you're answering in the chat. Number 3, how can you and your colleagues demonstrate that you are trustworthy, both to children, young people, parents and carers, and other staff within your setting? How can you work together with your families in positive ways to show that even though you do not always have the answers, you are working together and you're there for them? Number 5, what ways can you show children and young people that your setting cares? So are you adopting a trauma-informed approach? Are you adopting a whole school send approach? Are you fully inclusive as a school or setting? 6, in what ways do you celebrate their achievements and focus on the strengths of the people that you work with? 7, do you practice a fixed or a growth mindset in your setting to best support your service users, children, young people and other staff? 8, how do you bespoke what you offer and ensure choice so that it takes account of people's individual experiences and needs? Is there anything that you do well but could do better? So we want to share here, we work across a lot of local authorities in England, more than 50 at the last count. And Stockport Local Authority is a local authority that are doing it well. And we often hear about local authorities that aren't doing it so well. So we just thought we'd share some good practice really, and something that people in other local authorities could maybe take back to their leaders and talk about, and even adopting a similar approach within a school or setting, as it is possible to adopt a similar approach to what Stockport Family have done. So just a few minutes of a video that it will be good to share.
This video talks you through Stockport Family and the approach the council is taking to work within an integrated service for children, young people and family, as well as working in a new restorative way with Stockport's vulnerable families and children.
Claire and I work closely together in terms of our responsibilities for all children's services across Stockport, in terms of our joint responsibilities. It's all frontline services to children and families.
So every family, even if they're having the worst time, will have a strength. It might be something that they're very good at, or another family member who's particularly able to help. So it's looking for those strengths and making the family feel good about those strengths. Or, you might be doing it with a child in school. You might be doing it with a group of children where there's some bullying, looking for what's good about, their school life or their family life. But then also really saying, right, actually, those things are good, but what can we do to work with you rather than imposing things on them? What can we do to work with you to make the things that aren't as strong in your family a little bit better?
We aim to work with families to help them find their own solutions to that problem. You might hear us refer to this as a restorative way of working. Essentially, this is an approach that builds on the strengths of a family and the community by working with them, rather than delivering services to or for them.
The Stockport Family Service aims to ensure that children and their families get the right support at the right time. It is a new service that brings together social workers with the wider children's workforce that already includes health visitors, school nurses and midwives.
One of the biggest differences is that we are promoting a real team approach in 4 localities where there is a sort of a recognition between multi-agency teams that they are a team. For example, here you'll see here in Central House, we have colleagues co-located. And that's quite symbolic, really. The 4 localities are important in that it gives a sense of you work for that locality. You are a team around that locality, much more so than you are attached to your employer. I think the most important thing for us is that we want to hear from families in terms of, so how is it for them? Have things improved for them? That's the most important thing for us, that the families' voices of Stockport Family is very loud and clear.
The whole family's health and well-being is something that if you improve that, generally the rest of it follows on.
So families come first, families' needs come first. It hopefully relieves colleagues from worrying too much about what their organisation requires of them, to more importantly, what families and communities require of them.
So really interesting, and we are lucky to be based in Stockport, so we can see this work and the impact it does have, and it really is in line with what we're doing as an organisation. And if you work in a school or educational setting and you are struggling to manage challenging behaviour or struggling to get a child or young person to engage in education, one thing that we always promote, and it's very in line with that video, is that working with the whole family ensures better outcomes for children and young people. When you know everything that's going on for that child and what their world looks like and what they've been through, and it might not be anything horrific, it might just be something that's been difficult for them to deal with. You're not just always looking for abuse, but there are lots of different reasons why that child might be struggling, and there is always a need behind that behaviour. And having those relationships with families is probably the most important part of what you do, and will get the best out of that child or young person. And just listening, taking the time to understand, and then implementing the relevant support, and it will just make everybody's jobs easier, but most importantly it will make that child's life better.
Please have a look on our website at the resources and downloads tab, where you will find lots of free resources, including an anxiety workbook, growth mindset workbook, how to explain the pandemic to your child, lots and lots of different resources that we hope you'll find helpful. You can also contact us on the phone number listed, 0161 549 1169, and email us at info@greatmindstogether.co.uk. We hope you found this webinar very helpful. Please feel free to continue in the chat. We're going to be around for a while, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks everyone for your time today, and we're around now for questions and answers about the webinar.